It began like any other day, a warm morning 66 million years ago. Somewhere on a green floodplain, dinosaurs moved through the mist toward a river, just as their ancestors had done for 100 million years. The world was theirs, and it had been for longer than we can truly imagine. Everything was normal, everything was calm, and if any of those creatures had happened to glance up at the sky that morning, they would have seen something new, a point of light where no light should be, growing brighter and brighter. This was the last morning of their world, because that day would become, without any competition, the most terrifying day in the entire history of planet Earth. And here is the astonishing part. Thanks to modern science, we can now reconstruct that day, not in vague strokes, but hour by hour. We can read what happened, written into the rocks and fossils it left behind, so let's live through it. The worst day life on Earth has ever known. But first, let's be fair, because Earth has suffered many catastrophes across its 4.5 billion years. There was an event so devastating that scientists call it the Great Dying, when almost all life on Earth was wiped out. But that unfolded slowly over thousands of years. There was an even more violent moment near the very beginning, when a world the size of Mars is thought to have slammed into the young Earth, melting the whole planet and flinging out the debris that became our moon. But back then, there was no life, no one to feel any terror at all. So the single most terrifying day, the one that living, breathing creatures actually experienced, is a different one. And it started with that new light in the sky. That light was an asteroid, a mountain of rock, somewhere around 10 kilometers across. Try to picture that. An object the size of a small city or a large mountain hurtling through space on a direct collision course with the Earth. And it was fast, moving at around 20 kilometers every single second. That is more than 20 times faster than a rifle bullet, and no creature on Earth had any idea it was coming. There was no warning, no defense, nothing but that growing light in the morning sky, and then it arrived. It struck in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and the moment it did is almost impossible to describe. It was moving so fast that the air itself couldn't get out of the way. It punched a hole clean through the atmosphere, and when it hit the ground, it released an amount of energy so vast that our normal words fail. Scientists estimate it was equivalent to billions of atomic bombs, all detonating in a single instant. The asteroid itself was vaporized on impact. So was a colossal chunk of the Earth's crust. In an eye blink, it gouged out a crater more than 180 kilometers wide, a hole in the planet you could see from space, and at the point of impact, it created a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun. Anything within hundreds of kilometers was simply gone, incinerated, erased in the first second. But the impact was only the beginning, because in the minutes that followed, the horror spread outward across the entire planet. First came the blast wave, a wall of superheated air and unimaginable pressure, flattening everything in its path for hundreds of miles. Then came the shaking. The impact triggered an earthquake beyond anything in the modern record. Scientists believe it may have reached a magnitude of 10 or even 11, thousands of times more powerful than the largest earthquakes we have ever measured. The entire planet rang like a struck bell. The ground heaved and cracked on continents thousands of miles away, and then came perhaps the most nightmarish part of all, the rain of fire. Remember all that molten rock and debris blasted out by the impact. A huge amount of it was hurled up out of the atmosphere into space itself. And what goes up must come down. Across the entire planet, that molten debris began to fall back through the atmosphere. And as billions of tons of it rained down, friction with the air heated the sky. The whole sky. All around the world, the atmosphere itself began to glow, turning into something like a gigantic broiler, radiating searing heat down onto the surface. For creatures far from the impact, who had survived the blast and the earthquake, the sky itself turned into an oven. The intense heat is thought to have ignited wildfires across entire continents on the very same day. Picture that. A planet whose sky is glowing red-hot, from horizon to horizon, cooking the land below. And there was still more. The impact had struck near the sea, and so it launched mega-tsunamis, not ordinary waves. Walls of water possibly more than a kilometer high near the impact site, surging outward, sweeping across everything in their path. And here is where the science becomes almost unbelievable. Because in North Dakota, thousands of kilometers from the impact, scientists have found a fossil site that appears to capture that exact day. They found fish that died in a sudden violent surge of water, killed within about an hour of the impact. And embedded in the gills of those fish are tiny droplets of glass, droplets formed from the molten rock thrown out by the asteroid. In other words, those fish breathed in the debris of the impact as they died. We are quite literally looking at fossils of the first hour of the apocalypse. We can read that terrible morning in the stone. But as horrifying as that day was, the day itself did not do the worst of the killing. The true executioner came afterward, and it was silent. Because the impact threw enormous quantities of dust, soot and sulfur high into the atmosphere, and that debris spread around the entire globe, forming a thick veil that blocked out the sun. And so the world went dark. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months and possibly years. Scientists call it an impact winter, and in that long darkness, the real catastrophe unfolded, because plants need sunlight, and with the sun blotted out, photosynthesis largely stopped across the planet. The plants began to die, and when the plants die, the creatures that eat plants starve, and when they die, the creatures that eat them starve too. The entire food chain collapsed from the bottom up. Temperatures plunged. Acid rain fell from the poisoned sky, and over the following weeks, months and years, life on Earth was gutted. When it was finally over, around 3 out of every 4 species on the entire planet were gone, extinct, including every last one of the great dinosaurs that ruled the land. Think about the scale of that ending. The dinosaurs had reigned for around 165 million years. They were among the most successful animals that have ever existed. And their long, magnificent age was brought to an end, in essence, by a single day and the darkness that followed it. One morning of fire, and a world that had lasted for eons was gone. So that, without question, was the most terrifying day in the history of the Earth. But now I want to tell you the part that turns this entire story around, because that most terrifying day was also, strange as it sounds, one of the most important days that has ever happened. For you, specifically. Because in the ruins of that shattered world, something was quietly waiting. Small survivors, tiny, furry creatures that had spent the entire age of the dinosaurs living in the shadows, scurrying in the dark, staying out of the way of the giants. These little animals were the early mammals, and for 100 million years they had been kept small and hidden, unable to rise, because the dinosaurs dominated everything. But now the giants were gone, and an entire empty world lay open. And so those small survivors crept out into the light, and they began to grow, to spread, to diversify into an astonishing variety of new forms. Over the millions of years that followed, mammals rose to fill the world the dinosaurs had left behind. And among them eventually came the primates, and from the primates in time came us, which means something incredible. If that asteroid had missed, if it had passed by just a little to one side, the dinosaurs would very likely still have ruled the Earth. The mammals might have stayed small and hidden forever. Primates might never have evolved. And you, listening to this right now, would almost certainly never have existed at all. The most terrifying day in the history of the Earth is the reason you are here. A day of death that became the doorway to your entire lineage. And there is one final thought worth holding on to. The dinosaurs never saw it coming. They had no way to look up and understand the light in the sky, no way to fight back, no way to do anything at all, but live their last, ordinary morning. But we are different. For the very first time in the 4-billion-year history of life on this planet, there exists a species that can look up and understand. We now scan the skies. We track the asteroids that cross our path. We map them, and we watch them. And recently we even succeeded for the first time in reaching out and nudging a small asteroid, gently changing its course, as a test of whether we could one day defend ourselves. Think about what that means. The dinosaurs were victims of the sky. We have become its first watchmen, so the most terrifying day in the history of the Earth was a day of endings. The end of a fireball, the end of a long darkness, the end of the greatest creatures the world had ever known. But every ending in the story of this planet has quietly been a beginning somewhere else. That falling star that ended one world also lit a fuse that burned for 66 million years, through the rise of the mammals, through the dawn of the primates, all the way down to a single, curious creature. A creature that could dig up the bones, read the glass in the rocks, and finally look back across all those ages and understand exactly what happened on the worst morning the Earth has ever seen. And maybe that is the most remarkable thing of all, that the terror of that ancient day did not have the last word. Life did. It always has. And now, at last, life can even look up and watch the sky.